perhaps. I want to say thank you. The way that we're going to be looking at evaluating impact is through these two films, looking at case study throughout them. So we're going to have John do a little intro to the clip for Rancher, Farmer, Fisherman.
So we're going to show you just the first few minutes of the film. The film premiered at Sundance last January. It premiered during the inauguration. And it is a film that came about because of my friendship with Miriam. She was telling me about this book that she was setting out to write and the characters that she had chosen to base the book on. And I said, I think that there's a film in there, and why don't I make a documentary at the same time that you're writing the book? I was an independent producer at the time. And then when I was asked to join Discovery, we brought the project with us to Discovery. So this is Rancher, Farmer, Fisherman.
Maybe about the impetus for making this film.
Well, so first it was an impetus to write a book, and that really came from working at Environmental Defense Fund. EDF is a little unusual in that we make a practice of working across partisan lines and of working with large-scale food producers and agribusiness and the kinds of partners that some environmental groups might shun. I knew from that work that there was a very false story being told in the country about about environmentalism as a partisan issue, and I felt that was a myth that was doing a lot of damage to the country. It was licensing a lot of harmful policies. It was terrorizing a lot of congressmen into inaction, and I felt it was really important to reveal the story I knew to be true, which is that conservation is not a partisan issue in this country. It is a deeply held core American value and held no more strongly than by the people who work the land and the water. And so really a big part of the impetus was political, to try to make some space for positive political action. The other impetus was to continue to advance these kind of unlikely partnerships that EDF pursues, and we'll talk about that more in a while, but that was really so most of the progress that we make, whether it's on improving water quality or protecting monarch butterflies, comes because of partnerships with people who are lifelong members of deeply conservative groups like American Farm Bureau or National Corn Growers. And so this was intended as an instrument to further deepen those relationships and therefore be able to advance that work further.
So Miriam says it very well now, and she said it well then, and it was very convincing to me that this was reason, it interested me to cover this territory. It would be new territory for me as a filmmaker to tell environmental stories. And the characters that she identified, there are 5 in the book. We focus on 3 in the film. We had the great advantage of being able to read some of Miriam's early writings, Susan and I, and were immediately convinced that these are indeed fantastic characters. So there was this tremendous advantage. I mean, I said to Miriam right then at that lunch, and I continue to say it, that she had done really half the work that's required in making a strong film. She had found great characters. Then just moving forward with the filmmaking process, it would hopefully make itself. So.
And I just wanted to add one thing, which is that only 1% of Americans ranch and farm and fish, but they take care of 70% of the American landscape, and they fish the largest waters on the planet. So the responsibility that are in these people's hands is huge.
So my next question is, how does this film lend itself to an impact campaign? Was it mandated? And I think sort of you answered that a bit when you first started just talking about the impetus for writing the book and the film, but do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Well, impact producing is something which has been a part of my work from the very beginning of my career. the very first work that I ever did was HIV prevention work, and from the first grants that I got from the Ford Foundation for that work in 1985, there wasn't a term impact producing, but we were impact producing. The whole purpose of that content was to get HIV prevention messages into really hard to reach communities. So that has really shaped my career. It's always been a part of it. And so the role of partnerships is something that has also played a very big part in my work. And the difficulty of partnerships is something that I understand, but I respect greatly, because the sort of hard row to hoe is worth it, because there's tremendous returns when you have strong partners, whether that be the government or nonprofits, foundations. So my work at HBO, tackling complex health issues, always had partners from government agencies to foundations. So when Miriam and I started talking, and there was this potential to have some kind of relationship with EDF, I knew that it was going to add to the value of my experience, and it was going to assure a kind of impact producing down the road when the film was done. But navigating that and negotiating that was something that required a lot of work, a lot of conversation, a lot of compromise. And we'll get into that a little further, but there's tremendous value, and I think it's almost essential in doing successful sort of impact producing, and I talk about the long tail of a film, and I think that you get a much longer tail when you have strong institutional partners.
And so, am I right in thinking that as soon as you committed to doing the film, that it was part of what you were thinking about was the impact plan that was going to be going along with it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, an incentive for me as a filmmaker for doing the project was because of the impact work that would eventually come. It fits in, with who I am as a filmmaker, and my interest in getting involved with films is this impact aspect to the life of the film.
Okay, we're going to move on now to 32 Pills. Beth, do you want to set it up at all, or do you want to just show the clip?
I think we'll just show the clip, but one thing that interests me is just how different these films are, and how different their impact stories are and probably will be. So I think you'll get a sense of the difference when you see the clip.
You want to talk a little bit about the film and why it was made? And
yeah. So the film, we started making the film in January of 2015, and Hope's sister was a woman by the name of Ruth Lidoff. She was a really talented artist and photographer in New York City. She struggled with mental illness, and she took her own life in 2008. And when I met with Hope, she felt that sort of when her sister died, that a part of her died as well, and that she really wanted to try to figure out what happened, so that she could kind of return to life as sort of an emotional person, and she could understand what happened and could sort of go on. But she also wanted to make the film because she was in a suicide bereavement group. So there were about 5 people who had all been survivors of suicide, of loved ones or family members. And as a result of that experience, Hope really realized how alone they all felt, how lucky they felt to have one another. And sort of over the years, Hope came to realize that there's very little support for people that are left behind by a sudden death, by suicide. And so she wanted to make the film to come to terms with her own experience, but she also really wanted to create an opportunity for people to possibly share their own stories and feel less ashamed. She wanted to destigmatize mental illness, and she really wanted to make suicide something that we can talk about. So it was very personal, and yet there was sort of this larger idea from the get-go.
That's great. So impact was baked in, essentially, or this engagement component was definitely baked in and part of the plan from the beginning.
I think it was baked in from the beginning.
Yeah.
We were definitely thinking about it, and as many of you know, when you're applying for grants, it's, these days, if you're applying for social impact grants, it's really something that you have to be thinking about. And we were actually really lucky. We were grantees. We received a fledgling fund grant of sorts. We were in the Outreach and Engagement Lab for a year. And over 4 retreats, or maybe 3 or 4 retreats over the course of a year, and then monthly phone calls, we were always working and thinking about our outreach campaign and developing it, and who was our audience, and how are we going to reach them, and what were the kinds of partnerships that we could possibly form. But it actually became a really complicated and difficult film to produce. And so probably like many others as well, I mean, managing and developing that outreach campaign while we were making the film proved really difficult. So we knew we were going to do it, but kind of developing it and alongside production proved really challenging. So, you know, what was great was, by virtue of us being part of this lab, we were sort of constantly nudged to move forward. So we had conversations with potential partners, and we brought them into the film, and we told them what we were doing and what stage that we were at and what we would like to do once the film is complete. But what's really exciting is, you know, now that the film is finished, it's here in New York, it's going to be on HBO soon, I feel like really in the last 2 months, maybe 6 weeks.
Seems like a long time.
But anyway, we've really started to move it forward and crystallize potential partnerships and identify ways that we can have impact that I think that Hope and I never imagined, and a lot of that has to do with Lise. So, you know, we've been working and really right now are really kind of in the trenches and bringing the outreach campaign to fruition and solidifying the road moving forward. And what we are aiming for is that long tail, you know, and how do you create those partnerships that work for your partners and that work for you so that so that the film can continue to live on and it can really have the impact that you hope it to have.
Yeah. And I'd say you're right. I mean, I think if we're looking, I think part of the reason that this panel was put together the way it was is because these films are very different films with very different campaigns, with different goals. And I want to kind of delve into that a little bit deeper now. Lise, I'd love to hear from you. As an impact producer, how do you define impact? And then what your specific, I mean, Beth just said them, but if there's anything more, your specific goals for this particular film.
So, well, first of all, when you're doing impact producing on your own film, that's one kind of an experience. And you've been thinking about it for a long time, and as you say, it's baked in, or it can be the reason why you decided to make the film. When you come on later, it's a different experience. And so part of the responsibility to do social impact is to go to the filmmakers and say, why did you make this film? What was your passion? Like, why did you decide to devote, like, years of your life to this, and what would you hope and expect to have as your highest goal for what the film could do? And then I start from there, because that's the question I would ask myself if I were the person making the film. So for this film, it seems that there are 2 different possibilities for impact, what I call soft results and hard sort of quantifiable results. The soft results are when you're talking about changing hearts and minds, right? When it has this incredible platform of being on HBO. It's a beautifully made film that, you know, really takes you inside this woman's experience and inside this world. So it's a really well done film. I feel really honored to be working on it. It makes my job a lot easier when the film is fantastic. So what does that mean? That means if it's going out into families in Des Moines or whatever, that they watch the film, that's a soft impact. It's really difficult to quantify, for example, how that's rippling across the country in terms of the way people think about suicide or may self-identify as having a mental health issue, et cetera. On the other side, where I think we brought you some new ideas was after I listened to what Hope and Beth said were their aspirations, I said, well, what about public policy impact? What about educational opportunities? What about, and I kind of listed these more sort of quantifiable, hard answer, yes or no, did we get it done or not, kind of opportunities. And it was really beautiful to hear Hope say, I never in my wildest dreams would have thought that going down this road and exposing my life and trying to figure out the death of my sister could have an impact on public policy. She said, that's like, wow. And I was like, okay, this is great. Like, to be able to take her dream and elevate it is really an honor. So we're doing both pieces.
That's great. Meredith, I'm going to ask you the same question. So how do you define impact broadly and then specific goals for this film?
Sure. I think the question's a really good one, and I think that if we're all being honest, we have to talk about the fact that there is no standard definition for that, and in fact, in this business and as this sort of nexus of media and social change has evolved over the last, decade, 15 years, I mean, it's been going on for well before that, but it's become sort of formalized as an industry really over the last, decade plus, and yet I still hear terms bantered around all the time that there really are no set concrete definitions and understanding. Is social change, a social impact campaign, public engagement. People use these terms all the time, and I think that the best that we can do is recognize that there's, in my opinion, like a very important sort of analytical process that one can go through when you are looking at what that can mean for a particular project and whether in fact you should even be engaging in a campaign for every single film. I have pretty strong feelings that we shouldn't be, and that there's a lot of pressure on filmmakers these days to actually engage in a campaign for every single documentary that exists, and that may not be in the best interest of the issues writ large. But I think that you are doing things like Lisa was saying, like, you're beginning with, of course, like, what were your goals for this, and recognizing and giving credibility to the fact that when you are coming in at a certain point, there has been an awful lot of work that has gone into that film well before you ever showed up, and that there's very importantly a lot of research that's been done. In a case like this with Miriam, she's an expert on these issues. She didn't just begin to understand these as she started to write the book. She wrote the book and then got involved in the film because she had a very strong perspective about this and gap in the, in public consciousness that we could shift. And so you have to hold that with very high regard. At the same time, what I hope to bring when I come to these projects is a particular process that is sometimes very helpful to be one step removed, because you have to be able to say to people, what is realistic? Like, this is not $1 billion of federal aid. It's a film. It's very powerful. Do we want to look at this as a standalone piece and sort of what we hope to accomplish? Are we looking at this as a constant drumbeat in society of other environmental films on this? And so, I'm sort of summarizing what's a very complicated process, but I think it's a dance. It's a dance to say what matters to you and where do you see the opportunity, and then also with fresh eyes and with experience, what can we bring to the conversation as well about where maybe we are going to push you to be a little bit more analytical about it or questioning, and you find that space. With regards to this film, we had two primary goals. One was just, drive an audience, right? If they don't see it, there's no conversion factor, right? That you can't engage people and call them to action and change hearts and minds and policy or anything else if they don't actually see it and get the message. So there is a very big functionality that's just being really smart about who the audience is, who we want, how we're going to get them, how we're going to find them, what are the key messages, and how do we just do the labor to kind of get out there and reach those organizations conversations and drive them in. And so we did that pretty steadily. And then the other was a very deep process with EDF, with Miriam and a much larger team at EDF, to really understand their work, to go very deep into sort of identifying, ultimately what we wound up doing was identifying key communities in the heartland that we felt doing deeper work would allow us to bring stakeholders around the table and either deepen relationships that the organization had and wanted to move forward for policy reasons, for collaborative conservation reasons, for programmatic reasons. These were communities we, after many, many conversations, identified strategically as we could really move the needle in these spaces, either because there was like a tipping point moment there because of the relationships that had been developed and various opportunities, or the organization had been struggling to sort of find, to bring those key partnerships to the table and elevate them in a way that would then open the door for their work. And that work is going to continue for a long time. And this, this kind of work is hard, but the work we did in those communities really did have an impact, really brought some partnerships to the table that kind of blew open the door a little bit for EDF to do much more impactful work there.
I just want to jump in.
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful for people if we were somewhat transparent about some of how this came about. So when we were making the film, I alluded earlier to the relationship with EDF that had to be established. So it had to be established that although this was emanating from a lot of the work of EDF, it was emanating from an author who was doing the reporting and was publishing a book independently of EDF, and the film had to be produced independently of EDF. Otherwise, it's just it's a promotional vehicle for a nonprofit and not an independently produced film. So that takes a lot of discussion to get an organization that is so fundamental to a film to trust, and these are trust relationships at the end of the day, to trust that a lot of the thinking and the work and the relationships that they have been working on for years are going to be handled in a way that they are going to be comfortable with. I was confident that we would get to the end of that, but they didn't know me, and so they had to learn who I was and who Susan was, and that out of that trust and our work speaking, our previous work speaking for us, and these negotiations, we arrived at our editorial independence. So then there was, how is this film going to get funded? So Discovery decided they're going to fund the film, but EDF was able to raise a low six-figure amount of money for an impact campaign. And so that, they knew that this day was coming, but they didn't know how the film would turn out. We didn't know that it was going to get into Sundance. And so to Beth's and Lisa's point, I mean, we really did not begin designing the impact campaign till the film was done, because EDF was not going to invest this money in impact without knowing what the film is.
Got it.
So the work really began in earnest in the spring, preparing for the summer when the impact work would go on, to build awareness for the film, to leverage the fact that it's going to be on Discovery, and leveraging the fact that it had been a Sundance film. But it was a competitive bid process that EDF put out there for impact producing firms to go after. Pro-Social got the award of the contract because of a really superior presentation, and I think that we can then I can pick up from there, but that this was a process that really was one that I think that EDF managed with a lot of experience of put out contracts, RFPs for different agencies to go after different contracts with them. But at the end of the day, the scope of the impact producing was defined by how much money was raised.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you for that transparency. I think that's really helpful and important. You guys talked a bit about the strategy, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about ultimately how you are evaluating that impact.
Well, I can talk about what we actually did,
Yeah, that'd be
because
great.
I was there at every step of the way and
Yes,
am
please.
exhausted as a consequence. So we settled on, Meredith led us through, as she said, this incredibly disciplined process where I was working with my colleagues who work on endangered species and who work on pollution that comes off of farmland and who work on reforming fisheries, the people who are really in these worlds that the film addresses and that we were trying to continue to move forward. And so we convened these calls where Meredith kept pushing us to be very targeted about, okay, what are the critical states? First, we had to decide what are the key states that you guys are right at this tipping point, or there's something really on the line that you need to move forward, and who within those states are absolutely essential to your goals. And that really defined who our target audience was going to be. And we were intentionally small in these programs. We wanted, 75 or 100 of the key people in there. And in each state that we settled on, so we settled on Montana and Iowa and Missouri, and in each state we had really critical goals, and we wanted, this was absolutely essential to EDF, we wanted co-hosts of the events who signaled that this bipartisan, that this bridge building aspect of it. So our co-host in Montana was the Montana stock growers, the cowboys that raise the beef cattle. Our partner in Iowa was National Corn Growers, which anyone who knows anything about National Corn Growers, the idea that they would stand up with an environmental group in support of a film is, makes your head explode, and it actually made several farm publications like Stand Up and Take Notice. In Iowa, it was Iowa Soybean Association, who we'd been struggling to reach, and we had the Secretary of Agriculture, Bill Northey, who went on to become an assistant secretary in the USDA, which is a key place to have. We also had in every one of those rooms representation, like the legislative directors from each of the Republican senators in those states. So powerful senators like Ernst and Grassley and Daines, who are key to advancing these goals. And we had people like the Sierra Club, who normally wouldn't be caught dead in the same room as Monsanto and Smithfield. So to watch these partnerships kind of happen in front of our eyes, and these bridges actually being built by convening, a small group of key people in a room. We would combine a screening of the film with a panel discussion, and they were tremendously powerful events. The other thing that we have seen happen with the film is it's actually become an instrument that's being used in ongoing fights in each of these key states. So Montana has become very critical to the future of public lands and wildlife because of Steve Daines and Secretary of Interior Ryan Zinke. And so there are active fights underway in Montana where they are trying to drill for oil and gas and gold, like right next to Yellowstone Park. And so our film and our heroes have become active in those fights. In the Farm Bill is in play right now, so our farmer is actually in D.C. today testifying before Congress, trying to move the Farm Bill to protect the conservation title and some of the really key parts of it. And the fishing fight that is documented in the film, which is about protecting red snapper, which were almost destroyed, that's still a live fight, and the film is being used in that fight. So it's actually paid off as a very concrete tool that is playing a role. So in terms of measurement, Meredith's probably better to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, there were very specific relational outcomes that came out of those targeted, deep dives. And then in addition, we should also mention that we also took a sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom approach at the same time, knowing we had limited, but we couldn't do what we did in those 3 states all across the country. That was incredibly resource intensive. But, as part of the wide outreach we did, we'd also worked with groups and organizations that wanted to do that on their own. So there were over 50 local screenings and continuing and the requests continue to come in. And many of those are, community groups that have, versions of those fights at a very, very hyper-local level, and they're using the film in that regard. They're being used in universities as part of agricultural programs and environmental programs to talk about the fact that, like, can agriculture, big ag, actually be more sustainable? So those conversations are happening as well. So it's being integrated into curriculum. So you have sort of a range of impacts across the board. And I think an important thing, that I would say is that, like, the story isn't over, and what you go for is that long tail. And when you do talk about the deeper measurements that you're looking for over time, like, we don't often change the world, opening weekend of box office, right? Like, these are things we need to be in this for the long haul. And so the fact that these organizations are using the film, that they continue to, the requests are still coming in, and many of them, they range from, we want to use this as a conversation starter, to very specific agendas that organizations are using this film for.
That's great, thank you. And just so the campaign continues, is that right? There's no sort of end date?
From EDF, Discovery, and I have to call out Jessica over there, because Jessica has worked night and day, Jessica from Discovery, who, our contract with Meredith expired. We couldn't afford to continue that contract, so it kind of fell to EDF and Discovery to keep it going, and Jessica never says no. We've asked her we made endless requests to her, once in a blue moon, but I'm going from here to Kansas City tomorrow to speak to this huge sustainable ag conference. I'm going to the American Farm Bureau after that. So EDF is willing to continue with the campaign, because it directly serves our goals, but we would never be able to do it without Discovery's support, ongoing support, for no other reason than of their own commitment to making an impact.
Great, thank you. I want to move on now to 32 Pills and just ask, where are you guys in your campaign?
So I could just bridge from what you were saying. So first of all, kudos to you guys, because everything that's a social impact is aspirational, and it's an experiment. So there's no guarantee that when you go out there, you can have all the best ideas in the world, and you just don't know. So it's what we call a leadership intervention, and you just never know. But if you do your deep research and you don't actually, the work isn't done at the table. The work, 95% of the work is done before you get to the table. Your research, figuring out who your points of light are, who your contacts need to be, kind of figuring out your strategy, all that gets done beforehand, so that when you actually go, green light go, that you've increased your potential for success by doing all that advanced work, the research and the networking. So kudos to you guys. That's amazing. So part of what you were talking about with Environmental Defense Fund is similar to strategy for this film, in that you can't, as filmmakers, wouldn't it be nice if we could, but we don't tend to be able to stay on a project forever and ever. We have to get on to the next project. And so how do you make sure that a film has the longer tail? And that is the impact partners that you're able to make, who, if you do, you're lucky and do your due diligence and you make these good partnerships, they carry the work forward when you're done. I found that to be true with every film that I've worked on so far as in social impact. So the question do you want to talk a little about what your hopes and aspirations were with, like, Thrive NYC? And
Well, maybe, but you were also asking where we are now,
yeah,
right?
where you are now,
so I
in the
feel
campaign. And
okay. It's like, as you can tell, we're right in the middle. Like, we're literally, like, exchanging emails, like, all night long and all morning. Like, we wake up and, like, more emails and more text messages. We're literally right in the middle of figuring out our partnerships on the ground. And so we're kind of like, I asked permission from one of our potential collaborators if I could even mention them. So that's where we are in the process.
Got it.
Where we are is I've done the research and come up with a strategy. Because we're working with HBO, it goes back to HBO, goes through the process there. There is a guide that goes, a resource guide that goes along with the film. That's in process right now. There'll be a site on the HBO website, that's the 32 Pills page, which will include the resource guide and links for other resources outside of the resource guide. So it's all in process right now. To answer the question about the specific partnerships, for example, there is an organization here in Manhattan that's it's MHA NYC, which is the Mental Health Association of New York City. They happen to be, which I found in my research, I was surprised they're right here, figured they'd be in DC. They are the organization, the nonprofit, that runs the suicide lifeline, the 1-800-273-TALK that you'll see on bus, bus placards and stuff across the country. So we're in conversation with them right now about what kind of collaboration we might have with them, carrying their 1-800 number, or what we call the 1-800 number, the suicide lifeline, on a card at the end of the film. So we're right in that conversation right now.
I mean, the film is done, but tomorrow we are remastering because we got permission to put in a little card at the end so that, and actually it says, what does it say? You're not alone, which was, the very initial impetus for the project was to tell people you're not alone. And so it's a card, you're not alone, and lists resources of who to call or where to go for support. So it's funny because I'm like, oh my God, like we're going back in and kind of making this little change because of the outreach campaign, but it's really exciting.
To your credit, you insisted on it. You were like, we are going to get this done. So that was good.
So you guys are really in the strategy stage right now, and you're moving on to sort of developing those partnerships and...
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this week has actually turned out to be a really key week for us. So we're firming that relationship. We're firming a relationship with a large city organization, we hope. I'm going to go look at my phone after this panel and see what it says. And there's a bill in Congress, and we're hoping to have a screening in Washington in January, and we're working towards that. And we are working towards about 3 other national partnerships as a result of this first partnership with the Mental Health Association of New York City.
Well, there are in the research, there are a few key relationships, just like you were already linked with one particular partner. But for this, when we're talking about what are the issues nationwide, where is this message important, that's a deep dive research in figuring out where they're all connected. And there's a big organization in Washington, D.C. that's a public-private partnership. That's a wonderful resource because they cover everyone from SAMHSA and the CDC and the VA and everyone dealing with stuff from the government side, HHS. And there are the umbrella for these multitude of organizations across the country. So that's a really great win to have them talking to them.
I'm so sorry. Go ahead. Quickly, and then we got to turn
Well,
to
I just
questions.
want to acknowledge, if for filmmakers in the audience, of course, money is just always an issue.
Yeah.
And so, you guys have low 6 figures. At the moment we have low 5 figures. So, we're really, for us, the partnerships really feel so important because that is the way that the film can continue to have its impact if we are not impact producing actively, in the long term. So we really are trying to kind of make this push so that the film can do what we hope it can do, and that we can have resources that organizations and partners can run with as well, so that it's like they almost have the kit if we are not able to be there to facilitate ourselves.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I feel like we're just beginning this conversation, and there's so many different directions and ways that we could go, but I do want to have some time to answer questions from the audience, if anyone has any. All the way in the back? Yeah, you?
Hi. So, just wondering if Keystone Pipeline and fracking came into the discussion.
If the Keystone Pipeline and fracking came into the discussion.
No, I mean, we didn't try to touch every environmental fight out there. The fights that we're focused on, the closest we get to fights around the fossil fuel industry are in the first act where you saw a little bit of, and the first fight that cowboy fought was an effort to drill for oil and gas right along the edge of the wilderness area, and his crew is now involved in a similar fight to drill for gold right near Yellowstone Park. But we really just, we told sort of iconic stories. It wasn't intended to be a survey of kind of the environmental struggles out there.
We finished a human rights film, and we're running our terms of trying to run an impact campaign, which we're trying to do with like 2 people and no money, I guess what I'd like to ask is if you don't have the money to hire a pro-social or something like that, the best, I think I'm trying to summarize, the best strategy is just to partner with, high-profile organizations that can take the impact campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I've sorry.
Just repeat the question.
So the
I maybe didn't hear.
So the question is, if you don't have any money, how do you pull this off? And basically, and the answer to that is you go to your networks. I did a presentation for college kids, and they were like, "We want to be social impact producers. How do we do that now? Like it's a thing, And I said, "Well," they're like, "We want to go and talk to Congress." And I said, "Well, maybe you can't go talk to Congress, but you start where you are, and I'm sure you have more resources than college kids, but every single person who's engaged in this work, you're going to have networks. And the idea is go to your networks, talk to your friends, talk to your family. Same people you would go to for Kickstarter, you go to the same people. You go to LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn, and I, see who I know, who knows someone at that place, and I use those networks, and I ask them to help. And I say, okay, now everyone's got networks. And so it really is about like college students, okay, maybe you can't talk to Congress, but you know stuff that I don't know about how you get into classrooms and how you get other students engaged and talking about this. So that's what I would recommend.
This question comes up daily. It's very common. Obviously, I get calls all the time for folks, and it always ranges from, hey, can you raise the money to hire yourself to help us do this, to we have just tiny bits of friends and family money and how to do this. And I guess I would say, first take a step back. The question I always ask is which sounds, I'm been in the social change space my whole life, lawyer, community organizer, nonprofit, going on 30 years, and it's so a little antithetical, but I always say, first, why are you doing a campaign? Let me just ask that. Is it because you have a funder that said that's a requirement, for you to do a campaign? Because the reason I'm asking that is that the trap you can fall into if you really are not going to be able to raise significant resources, you have a couple avenues, and if you're being forced to do it by a funder, I sometimes ask that funder if that's necessary, right? Because maybe your best bang for the buck is that little bit of money you have really getting out there and making sure you get an audience for the film first and foremost, or that you're out there speaking on that issue, or frankly, maybe it's about getting you on to the next film that you're going to be able to make. Because I talk to a lot of filmmakers who feel that they get boxed in by funders where they say, I wanted to make the film, and now I'm being asked to spend the next year of my life doing this impact producing stuff in a social action campaign for which I'm going to raise $15,000, and I really wanted to go on to part 2 of this story or the next story that I had to do. And so I do sometimes just say, just hit the pause button for a second and have that conversation. That said, if you feel like I have a very unique story, there's a really unique opportunity, this film deserves some kind of a campaign, and it's just a conversation about the dollars, to me it is about being both very, very surgical. If you have limited funds, let's be realistic, not every film is going to suddenly change climate change, right? What is that surgical piece that you actually can tackle with limited dollars? And how do you stay laser focused on that? And secondarily, if you want to go the other way, it's all right, well, what's going to be your big swing? It's probably something more creative and unusual, and it's not necessarily going to be, how many partners can I get and who can carry this forward for me? It might be thinking about, okay, I'm not going to go after the NGO sector and try to get all these partner organizations to just do these screenings and conversations. Maybe I'm going to go after, the big CPG company, the big brand out there that's a big human rights violator, but who has huge channels of communication and resources, and they have, sort of a reputational issue that they need to address, that for whatever reason this is actually a solution. And so
Exactly it.
then they're all right. So then that becomes the surgical focus for you, right? Which is don't drain your resources and your time with a team of 1 or 2 people and very little dollars trying to cherry pick off, all the small NGOs out there that are going to be naturally aligned, and they're already probably converted. It's about sort of who's the unusual suspect with, if I got one hit here, it would be really transformative.
this is to piggyback on, this is really important because this is about finding the people for whom the film becomes a tool to advance the work that they're already engaged or already want to do. So you're not knocking on doors as a cold call. That's where you can really make impact and help advance the work. Your film may not be the thing that trips the trigger and is the catalyst for change, but you're adding to the work that's already out there. That's also a win.
And just to add really quickly, at Fledgling, we were going down a certain path when we were developing our outreach campaign, and we were really trying to move organizations from sort of A to B, like this was their focus, and then we wanted them to do this. And we really quickly learned you're not going to be successful, or it's going to take tremendous resources. So we then really shifted our strategy for it to not be about shifting A to B. Take the organizations that are in the space who are really working in an area that could use your film, but don't think that they might go from here and then go over here and use your film.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. You've had your hand up for a while.
If you are taking funds from organizations or corporations or whatever, do you run into the risk of jeopardizing your other funding because your objectivity might be compromised in that respect? If you're approaching a corporation that you want to get money from because and they're interested because it might help their brand, they have a reputational issue that they're trying to address, will it somehow jeopardize your funding because you're using less objective than filming? Just wondering if there are any conflicts there in terms of funding taken from corporations.
It's a very important question.
Oh, sorry, to repeat the question, though.
So the question is about how one be compromised by the source of funds that they have. If they have funding from a corporation, how might that compromise their objectivity and also affect funding from other sources? I have a lot of experience with this, and it is something which you have to handle very, very, very carefully, and you have to insist on editorial independence from any source of funding that you have, unless you are making something that is branded entertainment, and that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but it just has to be very clear to the audience who is funding this and why they are funding it. But if you are making a film that you want to premiere at a festival like NYC, that you want to air on public television or on HBO, there has to be a very, very, very clear line of editorial independence that can, be documented so that anybody who is broadcasting that, it is the rules. I mean, public television has very, very strong rules about these things. So it is possible. I have a long history of having major corporations who have put money into the films that I have made, but they have no editorial control over the films. Again, this is a trust relationship. You are asking, especially when it comes to a corporation, there's a big amount of trust that they have to have in you if they're going to be potentially having their brand be compromised because of something that their name is on, or even if they decide to take their name off of it, it's probably going to be an association that's already been established. So it's possible. But it is essential that these conversations happen right at the beginning about editorial independence.
And I'll just underscore that for public television and public media in general, there's a very intense sort of vetting system, and that's taken really seriously.
And EDF will not take corporate funding because of the concern that it will be perceived or in reality be greenwashing. So we only take foundation and individual funding. We won't take corporate funding.
Oh, good. We have time for one more question. I haven't done this side of the room. There you go.
Thank you. You talked, this is for Miriam. You talked about partnerships and unusual partnerships where you wouldn't look otherwise. And I'm really, really curious to know how the American Farm Bureau Federation where there would be any common ground at all with that organization?
Well, I can tell you my proudest moment on this book was the American Farm Bureau Federation review. Oh, the question was how could we find any common ground with American Farm Bureau? And it's a good question. They have been one of the biggest obstructions to environmental progress and good farming practices and climate action in the country. So, you know, we were shocked and thrilled when they first reviewed the book and called it the most important book you'll ever read about agriculture. And then invited me to speak to all of their state communication directors, and they've now asked me to come keynote their national meeting in January in Nashville. You know, they're in motion. The farm, there is, in the 4 years that I've been working on this project, and even in we've seen it happen in the film as well, the agriculture is really moving in a way that might not yet be visible to those of us who aren't paying attention, but where you are seeing the big ag companies, you are seeing the mainstream ag press, you are seeing the land grants that are training most of the farmers, and you are seeing the Farm Bureau and other organizations that are representing farmers confronting the reality of climate change directly, confronting the necessity to get on top of water pollution, and in some cases it's a defensive move because in a place like Iowa, the farmers are being sued by the city of Des Moines because they're polluting Des Moines' water, and so they have to get out ahead of water pollution because there are real costs to them. In the case of our many heroes, it is a sense of stewardship, a sense of responsibility to not trash the fisheries downstream from them by dumping nitrogen pollution into it. The reality is most farmers now, most people coming into the industry are coming out of land-grant colleges like Kansas State, where I'll be on Thursday, and you go to a place like Kansas State, they will tell you there's 3 degrees of warming that is going to happen in Kansas, and that 3 degrees of warming means that wheat yields are going to drop by half. And they're training all today's farmers. So there is a really remarkable opening up of the conversation that's happening, and the fact that Farm Bureau keeps bringing me back to talk to them seems to me, you know, really indicative of that, and recognizing, I mean, there will be issues that we disagree on to the end. Most of the heroes in the film adhere to what they call the 80-20 rule, where you focus on the 80% you can agree on and you leave the other 20% out of the room, because if you can move on the 80%, you have moved a very long way.